This screencast is going to review quite a bit of the geologic timescale, and I also want to talk about the absolute dating that goes along that allows us to be able to determine the dates on the geologic timescale. So here I can see in this demonstration I have a sample of 128 atoms, and they're all in their mother form. That's going to be the unstable form, but that is going to be the form of the radioactive element when this sample was taken from a specimen that was still alive. When specimens are found after the fact that the original organism is no longer alive, and as a matter of fact it is fossilized, then we can begin to see that the mother atoms will begin to decay into the daughter atoms, and sometimes they'll release energy that can be dangerous. And so here I can see in a sample of mother atoms of an organism that's still alive, they have not decayed yet. And in this particular demonstration, I want to show you that when the amount of mother and daughter are the same, so we went from 128 mother to down here now we have 64 mother and we have 64 daughter atoms. That means that we have already reached one half-life, because we've reduced the amount of mother cells from the beginning to the end of this half-life by half. And so that shows us then that one half-life has passed. And in this example, we were using 20 seconds to represent a half-life. So 20 seconds went by for half of the mother atoms to decay into daughter atoms. If I want to experience a second half-life, using the same sample here of a specimen that has been dead for a while because we've seen the decay, the next half-life would represent a situation where the mother cell number will drop down to 32. The mother atom number will drop down to 32 atoms, and the daughter atoms will then go up to, let me do the math really quickly, 94. And so we can now see that a second half-life has passed, and if I was talking about in time, that would have been an additional 20 seconds, and so after 40 seconds I would expect to have this much of the mother atoms and this much of the daughter atoms. And so as the mother atom number is decreasing by half, of course those atoms are converting into daughter atoms, and you'll see the daughter number begin to rise. Let's put this together into a real life or into more of a realistic concept. So carbon-14 decays from its mother atom unstable form into a stable form called nitrogen-14, which is its daughter atom. The half-life for this to happen, though, is much longer than the example we used earlier. And 5,730 is a standard number for the half-life of carbon-14 to nitrogen-14. So let's say that I have found a bone and I take it to a chemist, and the chemist tells me that today, in this day and age, that inside of that bone I only have 4 grams of the original mother carbon-14 atoms left, and I can see that the majority of them have decayed into stable daughter atoms, and I have 12 grams. That means that when this particular specimen was alive, we're going to be looking at a situation here that we saw earlier in this parallel. That means that all of the grams of atoms, whether they're daughter or mother, were originally mother atoms. And so I'm going to add that together, and when this organism was alive, there were 16 grams of carbon-14. Remember? Still alive. But I have now stumbled upon it, and the chemist that has done the measurements has told me what the new measurements are. Well, if they all started out at 16 grams of carbon, after one half-life, I'm only going to have half the amount of original mother atoms, and the other atoms will have turned into nitrogen-14. That means one half-life has passed, and for carbon, that is going to be 5,730 years. Oopsie. 5,730 years. Well, I found my bone in a different composition than that. So if I look to see what another half-life looks like, that means I have now 4 grams of carbon-14. Those other 4 then decayed into nitrogen atoms, which is going to bring that to 12, because it always has to equal 16, always. Nitrogen 14. That is a second half-life. That would mean that another 5,730 years had passed. 730, goodness. And so that is exactly the state that I found my bone in from the chemist, what the chemist told me. So I'm going to add those 2 half-lives together, and my bone is going to be 11,460 years old. Now, it's important for you to know, if you think your bone or the substance that you're testing is older than 50,000 years, you have to pick another radioactive element. You can't use carbon-14 because the amounts will be so tiny. They'll be trace amounts. It'll be so hard for the chemist to measure it. So you would find another radioactive element. And I told you one with a much longer half-life was potassium-40. That's the mother atom. It decays into argon-40, which will be the daughter atom, and that has a half-life of 1.3 billion years. And so you can use that for testing really old things, things that are much older than 50,000 years. So that's what led us to the geologic timescale. The geologic timescale is broken into eras. These are the eras that you need to know. There are 4 of them. Cenozoic, ceno meaning recent. Mesozoic, meso meaning middle. Paleozoic, paleo, we already learned earlier, meaning ancient. Zoic means time. So Cenozoic is recent time, Mesozoic is middle time, and Paleozoic is ancient time. The 4th and biggest, longest era before that would be the Precambrian. So on the board I used purple to represent the dates on the board, and so I'm going to use purple again for the Precambrian period. That's when we saw archaebacteria, photosynthetic bacteria, the very first eukaryotes, explained by the endosymbiont hypothesis, and then the algae. At about 542 million years ago, we're going to move into the Paleozoic. Just a fun fact, the Paleozoic era starts with the Cambrian period. That is why the era before the Paleozoic is called the Precambrian period, because it came before the Cambrian period. So this is the Cambrian period, and before that would be the Precambrian. That's where this era gets its name from. The Precambrian era makes up 87% of the life of the planet. 87% of the time that has been spent on this planet has been spent in that era, Precambrian. Oops. When we get into the Paleozoic, I think I used blue on the board for the Paleozoic, and so in the Paleozoic era, we can see that we have a really awesome explosion of diversity. We see the earliest fishes with a backbone. We see the earliest terrestrial plants, those that grew on solid ground. We see the first amphibians. Those would be like frogs and salamanders. They were massive. We see the earliest reptiles. So that's going to include things like snakes and turtles and crocodiles and alligators. But at the very end of the Paleozoic, moving into the Mesozoic was a major, major extinction. You see that a lot. That lots of times can define the end of one era and the beginning of the next. The next on the board was the Mesozoic, and I believe I used green on the board when I was trying to do those. So we'll use a green again about this middle time period. And lots of times this time period is known as the age of the dinosaurs. the age of the dinosaurs. And so here we see the earliest dinosaurs. We see the earliest birds and mammals. These mammals would be like marsupials with the pouch, or the platypus that lays eggs. It's actually a mammal that lays eggs. And so these are early forms of mammals. We see the first flowering plants, but then we also see a huge extinction, especially with the dinosaurs. And that's going to lead us from the Mesozoic, which the beginning of the Mesozoic was 299 million years ago, which was also the end of the Paleozoic. And now we're moving out of the Mesozoic and we're moving into the Cenozoic era. And I think I used red on the board, but I don't want to use too severe of a color, so I'm picking something close. Cenozoic, age of the mammal. And that's when we see the earliest placental mammals. Those are the ones that are going to be born live out of the mother instead of in a pouch or out of an egg like a platypus. We also see the early forms forms of the great apes. And on our own branch through evolutionary time, we see the evolution of the first man or bipedal man. Those are called hominids. So hominoids would be the great apes, and hominids would be humans. And so remember, when we were looking at the timeline with that analogy, we were 30 seconds before midnight when it came to that 24-hour analogy of the different milestones to happen on the Earth. So if we use the same colors that we used on the board, then we can see that the Paleozoic, by far 87% of the time on the planet was Paleozoic. We then talked about the fact that the Paleozoic took up about that much time. Then we talked about the Mesozoic, or time of the dinosaur, and then we rounded it out with the Cenozoic, which was the current era, and we talked about that being just kind of basically right there at the end of the timeline. So here's some cool diagrams. Oh, here is a diagram that I just left blank in case you want to practice your times and your dates and everything. And so I'm going to leave that for you, and you can write down the era and you can write down the times. These times don't necessarily correspond. Some of them don't correspond with your diagram. That's because it was from a different book, and different books can have different dates. So watch some of these dates. 65, definitely those corresponds with the end of the Mesozoic and the beginning of the Cenozoic. And so I left you that in case you wanted to practice filling it in. But the Precambrian, the first cells, archaea, are going to look a lot like these single prokaryotes. We see the evolution of the photosynthetic bacteria, and that would be an example here that contain chloroplasts. And then these are all kinds of modern eukaryotes that we would have seen at the very end of the Precambrian period that would have evolved. Moving into the Paleozoic era, we see the explosion of diversity. You see the first fishes, the first land plants. So this is what land would have looked like. This is what the oceans would have looked like. All kinds of crazy things. These are trilobites. They're pretty cool. Lots of trilobite fossils we find today. The first amphibians, frogs and salamanders, those that had to live close to the water. And then the first reptiles, which would have been organisms that developed scales that could move further away. So we're talking about snakes, turtles, and lizards, things like that. Mesozoic is the age of the dinosaur. We see the first mammals. Here's one right here. They're just, small rodent-like. We're talking about the pouched mammals, the marsupials. We're talking about the platypus, which could lay eggs. We see the first, excuse me. We see the first example of dinosaurs. We see the first birds. I mistyped that. The first placental mammals will actually be in the Cenozoic, so that's why I crossed it out. And we see the first flowering plants. And you can see evidence of that in the diagram. There's a flowering plant. Through this cartoon in, just to kind of show you that here you have the dinosaurs laughing at the porcupine, but really who should be laughing at who? The porcupine made it through the geologic timescale, and the dinosaurs didn't, so it's kind of a little bit of irony there. And then Cenozoic age of the mammal will be the first placental mammal. So something that stays in the mom, develops in the mom, and then is birthed live. And so that would be everything from like horses and deer and whales and rabbits and dogs and cats, all of those. We see the first primitive primates, also known as hominoids. We call those the great apes. We developed in a separate branch. We're the first hominids that walked on 2 feet. And then leads to the most modern forms of man today, which would be the Homo sapien. That's where we are right here. And you can see just the change in the structure based on their diet, based on their habitat, and based on their climate. Okay, that's it.